The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao was built by Frank Gehry and opened to the public in 1997. The story begins in 1991. Thomas Krenz, the director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, was looking for a new museum site in Europe. At that time, the American Foundation had several all over the world, the best known being the one in New York designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. In Spain, the president of the autonomous Basque region invited Thomas Krenz to Bilbao, a port that had seen better days. Its factories and shipyards were closing one after the other. It was an unlikely setting for a grand museum. According to legend, it was while he was jogging across the bridge on his run through the city that Thomas Krenz had a revelation. The museum should be just there, on that industrial wasteland, in the middle of the city, on the banks of the river. This site is in the centre of a geocultural triangle. There is the Bellas Artes Museum, the university, and the Opera House. The three main cultural centres of the city are there. The object was to have a building with a strong identity. The museum had to let the inhabitants take their city back. They had to turn their backs on the industrial period and stop fleeing the city as previous generations had done. They needed to get back their civic pride. The museum had to be a monument. The American architect was already celebrated for his strange, deconstructed shapes, but for the museum in Bilbao, he would create a building to match the scale of his ambition, a monumental sculpture with a chaotic, abstract look to it. In fact, the building is more easily read than it first appears. To the south, the dialogue is with the city, stone, right angles, windows aligned. To the north, there is empathy with water, undulations, fluid shapes. When volumes are separated, figurative silhouettes appear. There is a cruise liner, a metal flower with silvered petals, and even a fish with its head and tail chopped off. Fish and their movements have always been part of my architectural vocabulary. I think that it goes back to my childhood. Every Thursday, my grandmother took me to the Jewish market. We bought a live carp and took it home where we put it in the bathtub. I played with the fish all day until my grandmother killed it to make fish balls. The image of the fish appears right away in the very first sketches for the building. The extremely complex building at Bilbao started with semi-automatic writing. Frank Gehry combined the subconsciously drawn pencil sketches with the requirements of the building program. He interpreted his designs into a variety of volumes. His preliminary trial pieces freed him to work like a sculptor standing before his clay. I made ever bigger and bigger models, adding new elements and new pieces to the puzzle. Once I was on the right track and had a pointer to where it might lead, I started to look at the various parts in more detail. They developed in their turn. Then I went back to the rectangular, box-like basis and looked at it. Then I started to change its form until I reached a certain stage where I stopped, because I felt that that was it. A computer program used in aviation design helped to solve the constructional problems. A technician pointed to and digitally recorded 56,000 points on the surface of the model. The cardboard boxes became virtual. The program could calculate the practical feasibility of each mass. It could demystify the forms. A system of metal girders served the rounded skeleton. Every girder is different, each one made to the specifications given by the computer program. The American architect made a beautiful object as well as a correctly functioning museum. On one side he placed a shop, a cafeteria and an auditorium, and on the other side 20 galleries on 3 floors. He set the offices some way off. In one of the folds in the building, stairs lead the way down to the entrance. Although rather discreet from the outside, from inside the building is immense. The museum lies below the level of the city. In front of the entrance is an empty space. It is an atrium. The atrium is a sort of hybrid area, not really outside the building, but not entirely inside either. It is a public area open to the city and the river. A gigantic halfway house between the inside and the outside. In the atrium, the architecture is the first thing on display. The space is tightened, bowed, twisted. The materials confront and contrast. Frank Gehry speaks of a mix between a futurist city-like metropolis and Brancusi's workshop, cluttered with sculptures on a variety of scales. Set on each side of the atrium, stairs and lifts are hidden behind large glass scales, reminiscent of a moving fish. Shapes and materials that the architect used at the same time in a building in Prague reappear in Bilbao. Around the atrium, the areas are easier to understand. The galleries are situated concentrically. Each of the spaces is independent. Glass facades fill the gaps. The galleries on the ground floor are linked by the atrium. The galleries on the 2 upper floors are linked by passageways. This concentric layout in Spain is a reminder of Frank Lloyd Wright's building in New York. Frank Gehry makes the reference and then instantly forgets it. Thanks to the walkways and the outward view, visitors can make their journey through the works of art or stroll beside the city. Each time a visitor leaves the passageway to cross the threshold of a gallery, he enters into a different space, another world. 20 areas follow on, but do not resemble each other. Third floor. Galleries 305, 306 and 307. 3 galleries, 3 squares. Where the works are classical, the architecture stands back. There are straight walls and parquet floors. In a mischievous contradiction to the logic of the successive squares, Frank Gehry decided to make a direct access to a totally different space. The floor is concrete, it is 3 times as high, curved, leaf-shaped. This is gallery number 209. Ground floor, gallery 104. The room is 130 meters long. Frank Gehry's brief included requirements for a space to house monumental works. The architect made a gigantic capsized ship's hull. Ironically, at the end of this immense space, he put a tiny area for displaying just a few paintings. In the center, a sculpture by Richard Serra. Specially created for the Grand Gallery, it was installed during the building of the museum. 3 steel leaves undulate and brush against each other in a movement that recalls the building itself. So while the museum becomes a sculpture, the sculpture here is part of the architecture. How should a museum be lit? Thanks to the height of the ceilings, Frank Gehry could obtain a gentle cohabitation of natural and artificial light. Roof openings are pierced in each of the museum's galleries. By making light wells in the upper galleries, he could bring daylight into the square-shaped lower galleries. But the preference for the museum curators was for artificial light, because it is easier to control. So Frank Gehry decided to cut off or filter the natural light to soften it. Mobile filters were installed that could be removed in winter and reinstalled against the strong summer sunlight. In spite of all, some of the filters remain in place summer and winter. In the end, the works were lit by light bulbs just like every other museum in the world. Once outside, it's difficult to find where the various galleries are situated. Frank Gehry confuses the issue. Demonstration. The highest passageway is 26 meters from the ground. The highest point of the museum is 53 meters. Between the two, nothing. 27 meters of empty space that is inaccessible to the visitor. That is half the atrium. It would be possible to remove the whole of the upper part of the museum without touching a single painting hung on the walls. The relationship between the inside and the outside is totally upset by this loss of reference. On the outside, there are other reference marks to see. There is the material for each type of shape. The cladding of the classic galleries is in stone, square or rectangular. The galleries with rounded forms are clad in titanium. Titanium gives the building its identity. A skin comprising 24,000 square meters of metal plates. The repetition of sheets, folded and slightly bowed, emphasizes the movement. The museum is covered in scales to capture the light. The effect as the sun sets is guaranteed. I spent a lot of time trying to understand the light in Bilbao. The steel that I was meant to use in the beginning gave off nothing at all in the light of that region. The metal seemed to be dead under a grey sky, but quite by chance we found that titanium is very well suited to this sort of light. Most buildings can't afford this sort of metal because it's very expensive. By some miracle, the price of titanium suddenly dropped lower than the price of stainless steel. That has never happened again since, so I've never been able to use it anywhere else. In designing his museum, the architect made a real urban project. He created a new crossroads contiguous with the city. The railway line between was roofed over by an open space. This space is at the end of one of the city streets. It becomes a meeting place and redefines the riverbank. On Sundays, walkers rediscover the Nervian River that had formerly been neglected by the city. Thanks to a concrete ramp, they can rise above the water. A pond gives the impression that the river washes the walls of the museum. At the end of the building, the bridge, a gigantic metal rival, cuts across it. The museum absorbs it, passing below and re-emerging behind in the form of a tower. Stairs lead from the promenade along the riverbank to connect discreetly with the bridge. The architect brings the promenade a full circle and back to the city, leaving behind a hollow tower, a simple two-sided theatrical facade. When I designed the tower, I thought of a sail. There is a moment when you're sailing and the boat goes about and you face into the wind. Just for a fraction of a second, the sail quivers. I caught that moment. That is what I try to do with my buildings. Giving them an impression of movement pleases me, because that makes them part of the greater movement of the city. The buildings are part of life, and they change. There is something transitory about them. The association of an important cultural foundation, political goodwill, and an unbridled architecture has transmuted base metal into gold. This can be called the Bilbao effect. The industrial city has become the city of a cultural monument, the Guggenheim Museum of Bilbao. The American architect was already celebrated for his strange, deconstructed shapes, but for the museum in Bilbao, he would create a building to match the scale of his ambition, a monumental sculpture with a chaotic, abstract look to it. In fact, the object was to have a building with a strong identity. The museum had to let the inhabitants take their city back. They had to turn their backs on the industrial period and stop fleeing the city as previous generations had done. They needed to get back their civic pride. The museum had to be a monument. The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao was built by Frank Gehry and opened to the public in 1997. The story begins in 1991. Thomas Krenz, the director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, was looking for a new museum site in Europe. At that time, the American foundation had several all over the world, the best known being the one in New York designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. In Spain, the president of the autonomous Basque region invited Thomas Krenz to Bilbao, a port that had seen better days. Its factories and shipyards were closing one after the other. It was an unlikely setting for a grand museum. According to legend, it was while he was jogging across the bridge on his run through the city that Thomas Krenz had a revelation. The museum should be just there, on that industrial wasteland, in the middle of the city, on the banks of the river. This site is in the centre of a geocultural triangle. There is the Bellas Artes Museum, the University, and the Opera House. The three main cultural centres of the city are there.